the NATO-Ukraine Charter in 1997, followed by the European Union forging a Russia Partnership and Cooperation Agreement that came into force in 1997 as well. And this was followed by the first opening of NATO's door when Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic joined the alliance, invited in 97, joined in 99. And this takes us to Chapter 3, to the NATO-Russia Summit. More recently, following the surge of very hopeful cooperation after 9/11, the NATO-Russia Council was launched in 2002 with much fanfare. In fact, President Bush went to that summit and said that the NATO-Russia Council offers a pathway to an alliance with the alliance for Russia. That's a pretty bold proposition. And Putin himself returned in kind, arguing that Russia belongs in Europe. We should have a single security space from Vladivostok to Vancouver. And in parallel, European integration took a major step forward with the advent of the common currency, the euro. And the Big Bang took place at that same in 2004, bringing 7 new nations from Central Europe into NATO, 10 new nations into the European Union, major progress in advancing a Europe whole and free. It's the 4th chapter where this gets interesting. The strategy remained valid in the Balkans. In 2007, Romania and Bulgaria, they joined the European Union. NATO extended its reach into the Balkans as Croatia and Albania joined in 2009. But it was at this Bucharest summit, a summit where I was a lead staffer at the National Security Council, where we attempted to repeat the success in the East by seeking to advance Ukraine and Georgia, getting now into Putin's neighborhood, to advance Ukraine and Georgia towards NATO, while also trying to clinch a historic deal with Russia on missile defense and on strategic stability. But this is where the formula breaks down. We failed to begin the process towards membership with Ukraine and Georgia. We couldn't agree on that within the alliance. And Russia did not come on board. It rejected this offer of a common enterprise on missile defense and strategic stability. And all of this was against the backdrop of very gradual but significant change that was taking place in Russia itself. A very tightening grip on Russian society, media, political activities, the building of an increasingly building of a system based on corruption. And the Kremlin began laying the antecedents of policies that we see today. They laid out a doctrine of a privileged sphere of interest, then a compatriot policy to protect Russians outside their border, Russian speakers, then the invasion of Georgia, the recognition of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And this is where the West's response, well, we began to shift ourselves on our strategy and decided to soft pedal NATO, walk back from that. And we pushed the European Union into the front. And they moved forward with something called the Eastern Partnership, which started very modestly. It gained momentum. But it was in the run-up to this Eastern Partnership last November, shortly after we decided to talk about this issue here, that the crisis of today really began to unfold. Putin made clear on the eve of that European Union summit with these neighbors that this isn't just about NATO. It's about the West. It's about these countries joining the West. And so we saw that he first coerced Armenia and then Ukraine to drop their bids for closer ties to the European Union. Hence the Euromaidan, the protests in the streets of Kyiv, the crisis in Ukraine today. And so now where we're standing is we have this issue of a gray zone. We're struggling to understand. It's clear we're going to protect NATO territory. Every leader has been clear about the inviolability of the Article 5 guarantee to protect our allies. But it's not clear what future we want to have on offer for those outside. And so I think our task today is what's the best strategy? Is this concept of Europe whole and free still valid? We have unfinished business. If you look to the south, it's tough. We still have business to clean up in the Western Balkans. We have a Cyprus settlement that we're making real progress on. And we have Turkey and its relationship with the European Union left undone. But it's to the east where it's even harder. It's where the consensus really breaks down. Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova are on the front lines, obviously. But also, how does Belarus, Azerbaijan, Armenia, how do they fit into this conception? And ultimately, this is about Russia itself and its place. Clearly, Europe whole and free has lost momentum. And there are lots of reasons. Political will, given the domestic challenges we face, the financial crisis, economic challenges, enlargement fatigue, immigration challenges, corruption in these countries, concern that our institutions, the EU, NATO, they're too big, they're too cumbersome. And it's the reality that the nations that we're talking about right now, They're actually more difficult. They present harder cases for reform and transformation than some of those in Central Europe earlier. But the strategic factor that's in play is that we're dealing with a more authoritarian Russia opposing enlargement towards its borders. And in the 1990s and 2000s, we didn't have to choose between stabilizing Europe and irritating Moscow. So the cost of this integration has gone up. But equally, I would argue, the cost of denying a nation that European aspiration, that price has gone up. And this is because there's every risk that our decision to do nothing will actually invite further instability and invite further aggression. So ultimately, this is about security, stability. Past enlargements have actually had a calming, stabilizing effect on Russia's relations with its neighbors. Just imagine if Estonia or Latvia today were not in NATO. I propose to you that we would be seriously worrying about their future right now, just as we worry about Ukraine's. In fact, the calming effect has worked both ways. It was the confidence that came with NATO membership that gave Poland the courage to actually pursue its own rapprochement with Russia earlier this decade, and now we've seen a huge growth in trade between Poland and Russia. So what do I take away from these observations? That events in Ukraine, they lend a sense of urgency to the need to stand by the idea of a Europe home free, and that only when Europe's East is able to integrate with the rest of Europe will Russia's relations with its neighbors be on a stable, predictable footing, reducing these friction points with Russia. So I think our challenge is, how do you avoid leaving nations in an ambiguous vacuum that creates tempting targets of opportunity for a leader like Putin? And as Washington and Brussels grapple with this challenge, the problem is more difficult. But the dynamic is different. In that same speech in Mines in 1989, President George H.W. Bush said, "Today, the very concept of a divided Europe is under siege by ideas." And I think in 2014, unfortunately, we can say the opposite, that the very concept of a united Europe is under siege by Mr. Putin. So where do we start? Vision sort of anchors how we think about a real-world crisis. And it should be ideas, a common goal that guide our common efforts in Europe. After all, the transatlantic community needs a clear vision if we're going to develop a policy and a coherent strategy to support that. And this is what's animating my work at the Atlantic Council. Just in the past 2 weeks, we held a major conference on Towards a Europe Whole and Free that actually celebrated the transformation of Central Europe, looking at this is the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the 15th anniversary of the first round of NATO enlargement, the 10th anniversary of the Big Bang in both NATO and the European Union. But we also organized this conference to underscore that any effective response to Ukraine today, it has to be guided by a bolder vision and a bolder, broader strategy. So what I took away from our work over the course of this effort was the first NATO and the EU enlargement. They've been historic successes that we can't take for granted, and we can't fault for causing the difficulties in our relationship with Russia today. We shouldn't blame ourselves or our policies for creating a corrupt authoritarian leader in Moscow. Second, our strategy has clearly hit a roadblock. For 25 years, we've advanced this vision through this strategy of a deeper partnership with Russia, and that approach no longer holds, as Putin has rejected the idea that Russia has a place within this vision. And so third, that really means that we need a strategy that doesn't deny the aspirations of those nations that still aspire to integration in the internet and the transatlantic community, nor abandons the idea that Russia ultimately has a place within Europe, but while at the same time developing a more strategic response to Putin's aggression today. So the prologue of the current crisis in Ukraine traces back to this Vilnius story. So not much unites former Ukrainian Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, who just until recently was serving a 7-year prison sentence, with the man who actually put her there and refused to release her, Ukraine's most recent ex-president, Viktor Yanukovych. Yet, in meetings that I had with both Yulia Tymoshenko and Viktor Yanukovych, two enemies in politics in Ukraine, they told me a similar story about humiliation and debasement in their dealings with Vladimir Putin. For Yanukovych, it was the way that Putin spoke to him that came in this crass vernacular of a thug that he thought was meant to convey a sense of disdain that he had for Ukraine's independence. For Tymoshenko, who was recounting this story, and it made her visibly upset, almost crying, it was the way that Putin referred to Ukrainians as slaves, as peasants. So despite years of this type of treatment, both of these leaders struck deals with Putin that betrayed their nation's interests. Yanukovych rejected last November this path as the European Union offer that would have put Ukraine on a path of economic growth and political reform. And that was only the most jarring in a series of regional decisions made under Russian pressure. But Tymoshenko herself in 2009, in a historic gas deal, an energy deal with Putin, which amounted to national extortion, leaving Ukraine economically struggling, paying exorbitant prices, and lavishing Ukraine's government in a sense of corruption. So why do those that are living in Putin's neighborhood, who actually are humiliated and sometimes despise him, but nonetheless they do as he wishes? This is where Putin's, I call it his alpha male diplomacy. It brings together this personal humiliation, threats to cripple your economy, and the use of force to intimidate the neighbors. So even before annexing Crimea, the threats were precise, and we didn't always acknowledge this or recognize this in Washington. Bans on key imports, mass deportation of labor migrants, energy cutoffs during the most frigid weeks of winter, keeping his neighbors weak and compliant, making them unreliable partners for Europe and the United States, putting them just where he wanted them to be. And which is what played out last November in the EU's Eastern Partnership Summit, during which Armenia and Ukraine caved to Russian pressure and reversed their intentions. Belarus and Azerbaijan sat on the sidelines. And remarkably, little but courageous Moldova and Georgia, they resisted this pressure and they opted for a European future. But for how long can they resist? So let's unpack that story. Armenia was the first to succumb to Putin's bullying. Faced with Moscow's threat to sell arms to Armenia's rival Azerbaijan, combined with a guarantee of cheap energy, Armenian President Serge Sargsyan abandoned Armenia's European Union bid and opted for the Russian-led customs union. But in fact, it was Putin, not even Sargsyan, that announced Armenia's change in course. Armenia, his people were shocked, and the Kremlin website gloated. Then Putin began to outline a series of carrots and sticks to Yanukovych to ensure that the Ukrainian president also got the point. Strict border inspections leading to heavy commercial losses. Bans on chocolates of the oligarch that may actually be elected president of Ukraine. And the threat of burgeoning energy prices, they drove the message home. You even saw in authoritarian Belarus, Putin has sought to deter any rapprochement with the European Union by tightening Russia's grip on the control of Belarus's most lucrative potash company and using energy as a weapon there. So while Ukraine has become ground zero in the current struggle, there's no doubt that Putin's sights are also firmly fixed on the two tiny nations that have dared to stand up to his bullying, Moldova and Georgia. Russia began expelling Moldovan workers while rejecting imports of Moldovan wine and agriculture for failing to meet health standards. To ratchet up the pressure, Moscow's been increasingly financing Moldova's breakaway province of Transnistria. This Deputy Prime Minister Rogozin, he traveled to Transnistria and Moldova and declared ominously that Moldova's train to Europe would mean that it would lose its wagon of Transnistria. And he even joked at a press conference that the cold winter season is coming. We hope that you will not freeze this winter, pounding the message home that the nation's completely energy dependent on Russia. He's now just returned from Moldova from Transnistria, where he went to pick up the petitions of the citizens asking to be annexed to Russia. So despite the efforts of a new government in Georgia itself to actually try to normalize relations with Russia, Moscow began erecting fences, making permanent the unrecognized border that separates Georgia from its breakaway regions from Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So while the European Union has been clear that its offer of political and economic integration is not aimed at Russia, Putin's decided it is, and both the EU and US have greatly underestimated Putin's commitment to controlling his neighborhood. So right now we're witnessing the Russian-orchestrated rollback of freedom's game. The EU deserves kudos for its Eastern Partnership initiative, which was designed to encourage reform and integration in Europe's East. But without US leadership and engagement, Putin might succeed in creating this new dividing line in Europe. So what is Putin's strategy? President Putin striking back and playing for keeps in Ukraine. After losing his lever of control over Ukraine when the compliant and dependent former President Yanukovych fled to Russia, Putin's been seeking to gain this leverage by dismembering Ukraine. And he's been consistent in pursuing a strategy to prevent nations that once made up the Soviet Union from fully leaving Moscow's orbit. The classic Putin playbook is now on display. fuel separatist sentiments, justify military action by asserting the need to protect ethnic Russians or at least passport holders, and then go in and, quote, maintain the peace by stationing Russian forces permanently, in effect dismember your weak neighbors. The obvious result is that Moscow gains leverage over any recalcitrant neighbor by pounding home the message that permanent dismemberment is the cost of soliciting NATO membership, and Moscow has made clear since last year as well, European Union membership as well. And in turn, Moscow succeeds in making these neighbors undesirable partners to Europeans and to us, as we perceive them as carrying the baggage of regional and ethnic disputes and being unstable and unwelcome in the European Union. Western reluctance to embrace nations with territorial disputes only incentivizes Russia to make its stationing of forces in these nations permanent. So this is the manipulated cycle of negativity that keeps nations of the former Soviet Union tethered to Putin's authoritarian kleptocracy. And unfortunately, Putin has concluded from recent history that Russia can not only get away with this strategy, but that it's effective. And now we're watching it unfold centered in Ukraine. So this is not new. It didn't just happen. And this is partly why I've been thinking about this topic of living in Putin's neighborhood long before the actual crisis. Think about what it's been like before this. Russia's been financing the separatist regime of Moldova, stationing the forces. It fully occupied South Ossetia and Abkhazia in 2008, recognizes them as independent territories, despite the fact that South Ossetia doesn't even is depopulated with the exception of Russian forces themselves. And even in Armenia and Azerbaijan, who fought a war over Nagorno-Karabakh, they find that this conflict suits the Kremlin just fine, providing the Kremlin leverage over both. And in Europe's east, it's only Belarus that doesn't actually have its territory occupied by Russia. And I suspect in part Belarus enjoys this unique status because the authoritarian kleptocrat that runs Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, has made Belarus anathema to Europe already. So it's in Ukraine that Putin's been testing and probing with each of these escalatory steps that he takes to see how far he can go, what he can get away with. And this is a repeat pattern. And we saw this in the run-up to the war in 2008 in Georgia, when we saw all of the ominous signs. But we had begun to expect outrageous Russian behavior as normal without believing that Russia would actually ever resort to conflict, to war. And we were wrong. So if Putin concludes he can get away with it, he may not only move to wrest Crimea from Ukrainian control, as he's done, perhaps all of eastern and southern Ukraine,